Day 38, Psalm 37, 1 through 5. Prepare. There is nothing in your day that will be more important than what you are about to engage in over the next 10 minutes or so. You are going to seek hard after God, and for that to be successful, He must also be seeking you. Begin by praying the last verse in Psalm 119. I have strayed like a lost sheep. Seek your servant, for I have not forgotten your commands. Your deepest desire. Anxiety is emotional energy. One of the purposes of anxiety is to give us the energy we need to pray hard about something important. What is the most compelling anxiety in your heart today? Use that energy to cry out to God. Meditate. There are two famous psalms David wrote after his sins of adultery and murder that teach us about true repentance. Psalms 51 and 32. Psalm 51 was written during his repentance, and we see his deep anguish and sorrow. He cries out to God to restore his joy. Psalm 32 is written later, after his joy has been restored. And you can see that in both the opening and the closing. Psalm 32:1. Blessed is the one whose transgression is forgiven, whose sin is covered. Blessed is the man against whom the Lord counts no iniquity, and in whose spirit there is no deceit. It's so good to be forgiven. But that joy is only for the righteous and the upright in heart, not for the wicked. Verse 10, many are the sorrows of the wicked, but steadfast love surrounds the one who trusts the Lord. Be glad in the Lord, and rejoice, O righteous, and shout for joy, all you upright in heart. If David committed adultery and then covered it up by murdering the woman's husband, how can he be in the category of the righteous? It's because of the way he confessed his sin, which is what the middle part of the psalm is about. Take a moment to ask God to use this psalm to teach you the right way to confess sin so that you can have this much joy. We usually don't have the energy to confess the right way until we're driven to do so by the misery of guilt. Verse 3, for when I kept silent, my bones wasted away through my groaning all day long. For day and night your hand was heavy upon me. My strength was dried up as by the heat of summer. That describes the agony David was going through when he wrote these words in Psalm 51, verse 8. Let me hear joy and gladness. Let the bones you have crushed rejoice. It is when you feel crushed with guilt that you will confess the right way. If you've sinned but your heart wasn't crushed as it should be, James 4 is for you. James 4:8. Wash your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, you double-minded. Grieve, mourn, and wail. Change your laughter to mourning and your joy to gloom. Humble yourselves before the Lord. Ask God if there is some sin in your life you need to respond this way to. Back to Psalm 32. Once David's bones had been crushed, this is what he did. Verse 5. I acknowledged my sin to you, and I did not cover up my iniquity. I said, I will confess my transgressions to the Lord. The crushing of David's bones made his confession thorough. He uses 3 different words to describe his confession. I acknowledged, did not cover up, I will confess. In verse 5, David uses 3 different words to describe his evil. Sin, which is evil acts. Iniquity, that which is twisted or perverse. And transgressions, focusing on the violation of God's will and desires. David says, I did what was wrong, I was a pervert, and I rejected your will and the desires of your heart, God. He's using all his creativity and vocabulary to lay out the extremes of his guilt. Full disclosure. No more hiding anything or covering anything up. In verse 2, he says, Blessed is the man in whose spirit is no deceit. Are there sins that you've confessed only in a superficial way, only focusing on the deeds and not on the underlying heart problems? Have you understated the evil behind your actions? How would it change your confession if you discovered that God would only forgive as much as you're willing to confess? What is the result of this kind of confession? Verse 5, you forgave the iniquity of my sin. Literally it says you carried the iniquity of my sin. If you carry your own sin, you will die. But if God carries it, you're free from the burden. Completely free. Not just free of guilt feelings, but free of the actual guilt. Free of culpability. Free of the stain, and free of the punishment. Take a moment to rejoice and be glad over the sins you've committed, but that God now carries for you. Not only did God carry your sin, he also covered it. Verse 1, Blessed is the one whose transgression is forgiven, carried, and whose sin is covered. Shame is painful, so painful that we will do just about anything to keep people from seeing the full picture of our shame. There are things about us that are so ugly, if they were ever exposed, we would be horrified. If someone saw it, we would never want to face that person ever again. We need to have our shame covered. But when we try to cover it, it doesn't work. Proverbs 28:13, whoever conceals his transgressions will not prosper, but he who confesses and forsakes them will obtain mercy. If you try to cover up your own sin, God will expose it. But if you bring it into the open through confession, God will cover it. God will no longer look at you through the lens of your sin. It will no longer have any effect on how he feels about you. Verse 2, Blessed is the man against whom the Lord counts no iniquity. None of your past sins will count against you in God's heart. Take a moment to rejoice and be glad over the fact that none of your past sins have any effect on how God looks at you now. Sometimes when a person has trouble relaxing a muscle, a therapist will have him tense it up on purpose so he can feel what it's like when he lets go of that tension. Let's try something similar with the guilt of our sin. Imagine what it would be like to not be forgiven? What if God were still holding all your past sins against you? You might be one of those people who is hard on yourself, prone to self-condemnation. But not even the most self-condemning person in the world holds himself responsible for all his past sin, not even a fraction. If we could feel the weight of all our guilt, even for 1 second, we would probably die under the weight of it. Imagine never having a fresh start, ever. Every single new sin is just added to the pile. You could never wake up and say, "This is a new day." Imagine what it would be like if the guilt you feel right after the sin stayed that strong for the rest of your life, every single sin, and God just kept getting madder and madder at you. Now let go of all that imaginary guilt and do what verse 11 says. Be glad in the Lord and rejoice, O righteous, and shout for joy, all you upright in heart. Pray for others, enemies, and children. Think of some of the people that you have the hardest time loving. Pray that God would bring them to thorough repentance so they can have the joy you just experienced. Pray the same for anyone else who is on your heart today. Pray for the children in your life, that at an early age they would know the joy of forgiveness from God. Thanksgiving. If there are some sins in your life that you're tempted to still carry the shame of, name them specifically and thank God for covering the shame of those sins from His eyes, not allowing them to affect how He sees or feels about you, and releasing you from culpability. Take it with you. Pick one thought from this meditation that you want to carry with you through the day today. What can you use as memory cues in the upcoming day to help you bring that thought to mind at least twice more today?